The changing role of women. In ancient Rome, women were deeply involved in the religious and luxurious practices of the East. They eagerly participated in the bacchanals and the mysteries of Isis, often in large groups. Despite attempts to limit their extravagance through sumptuary laws, women were eventually allowed to follow the lead of men and indulge in opulent lifestyles. This led to noble women abandoning their homes and taking part in public life, attending the theatre, circus, baths, and other gatherings with great fanfare. Unfortunately, many of these women were idle and ignorant and quickly became corrupt. While there were still some women of fine character among the nobility, they were the exception rather than the rule. The traditional family structure began to break down, and although Roman law still gave husbands power over their wives, a new form of marriage emerged that left women under the authority of their fathers and gave husbands no control. In fact, to make their daughters even more independent, parents often provided them with a dower. Overall, the status of women in ancient Rome underwent significant changes, with women becoming more visible and active in public life, but also losing some of the protections and discipline of traditional family structures. Divorce was not uncommon in ancient Rome. It was a practice that was exercised by both the husband and the wife, but it was the husband who usually had the right to repudiate his wife. However, it was customary for this right to be exercised only in the gravest of circumstances. The wife also gained the right to leave her husband, and this made it very easy to break a marriage. There was no need for a judgment or even a motive. It was enough for the discontented husband or wife to say to the other, "Take what belongs to you, and return what is mine." After the divorce, either party could marry again. In the aristocracy, marriage was viewed as a passing union. Sulla had 5 wives, Caesar 4, Pompey 5, and Antony 4. Even the daughter of Cicero had 3 husbands. Hortensius divorced his wife to give her to a friend. "There are noble women," says Seneca, "who count their age not by the years of the consuls, but by the husbands they have had. They divorce to marry again, they marry to divorce again." But this corruption affected only the nobles of Rome and the upstarts. In the families of Italy and the provinces, the more serious manners of the old times still prevailed. However, the discipline of the family gradually slackened, and the woman slowly freed herself from the despotism of her husband. Chapter 23. The Peasants. The ancient Roman people were made up of small landowners who worked their land. These hard-working and sturdy peasants served as both the army and the assembly of the people. While they were still numerous in 221 BC during the Second Punic War, by 133 BC they had all but disappeared. Many had undoubtedly perished in foreign wars, but the main reason for their disappearance was that they could no longer survive. The peasants survived by growing grain. When Rome began importing grain from Sicily and Africa, the price of Italian grain fell so low that laborers could not grow enough to support their families and pay the military tax. They were forced to sell their land, which was then bought by a wealthy neighbor. The neighbor combined many small fields into one large estate and used the land for grazing. To protect his herds or cultivate the land, he sent shepherds and slaves to work the fields. At that time, Italy only had large landowners and troops of slaves. Great estates, as Pliny the Elder said, are the ruin of Italy. It was the large estates that drove the free peasants out of the countryside. The old landowner who sold his land could no longer be a farmer. He had to give way to slaves, and he himself wandered without work. "The majority of these heads of families," said Varro in his treatise on agriculture, "have slipped within our walls, leaving the scythe and the plough. They prefer clapping their hands at the circus to working in their fields and vineyards." Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebs, exclaimed in a moment of indignation, "The wild beasts of Italy have at least their lairs, but the men who offer their blood for Italy have only the light and the air that they breathe. They wander about without shelter, without a dwelling, with their wives and their children. Those generals do but mock them who exhort them to fight for their tombs and their temples. Is there one of them who still possesses the sacred altar of his house and the tomb of his ancestors? They are called the masters of the world, while they have not for themselves a single foot of earth." The city plebs. As the farms were drained, Rome was flooded with a new population. They were the descendants of the ruined peasants, driven to the city by misery. In addition to them, there were the freedmen and their children. They came from all corners of the world: Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Asians, Africans, Spaniards and Gauls, torn from their homes and sold as slaves. Later freed by their masters and made citizens, they massed themselves in the city. It was an entirely new people that bore the name Roman. One day, Scipio, the conqueror of Carthage and Numantia, was haranguing the people in the forum when he was interrupted by the cries of the mob. "Silence, false sons of Italy!" he cried. "Do as you like. Those whom I brought to Rome in chains will never frighten me, even if they are no longer slaves." The populace preserved quiet, but these false sons of Italy, the sons of the vanquished, had already taken the place of the old Romans. This new plebeian order could not make a livelihood for itself, and so the state had to provide food for it. A beginning was made in 123 with furnishing corn at half price to all citizens, and this grain was imported from Sicily and Africa. Since the year 63, corn was distributed gratuitously, and oil was also provided. There were registers and an administration expressly for these distributions, a special service for furnishing provisions, or the annona. In 46, Caesar found 320,000 citizens enrolled for these distributions. Electoral corruption. This miserable and lazy populace filled the forum on election days and made the laws and the magistrates. The candidates sought to win their favors by giving shows and public feasts, and by dispensing provisions. They even bought votes. This sale took place on a large scale and in broad daylight. Money was given to distributors who divided it among the voters. Once the Senate attempted to stop this trade, but when Piso, the consul, proposed a law to prohibit the sale of suffrages, the distributors excited a riot and drove the consul from the forum. In the time of Cicero, no magistrate could be elected without enormous expenditures. The corruption of the Senate was a result of poverty among the populace and luxury among the old families who made up the Senate. The nobles believed that the state was their property, and therefore divided the functions of the state among themselves, excluding the rest of the citizens. Cicero, the first new man to enter the succession of offices, was elected magistrate and held the position for 30 years. Some of the senators, accustomed to wielding power, believed that they were above the law. Scipio, who was accused of embezzlement, refused to exonerate himself, and instead said to the Romans, "It was on this day that I conquered Hannibal and the Carthaginians. Follow me to the capital to render thanks to the gods, and to beseech them always to provide generals like myself." To support their lavish lifestyles, majority of the nobles required a large amount of money. Many used their power to obtain it for themselves. Some governors plundered the subjects of Rome, while others forced foreign or hostile kings to pay for peace, or even for allowing their armies to be defeated. Jugurtha, for example, bribed a Roman general and escaped trial for murder by buying off a tribune who forbade him to speak. As he left Rome, he reportedly said, "O city for sale, if thou only couldst find a purchaser." The corruption of the army began when Marius admitted poor citizens to the legions who enrolled themselves for the purpose of making money from their campaigns. Soon, the whole army was full of adventurers who went to war, not to perform their service, but to enrich themselves from the vanquished. Being a soldier was no longer a sense of duty but a profession. The soldiers enlisted for 20 years, and upon completion of their service, they re-enlisted themselves at higher pay to become veterans. These people knew nothing of the Senate or the laws. Their loyalty was only to their general. To gain their loyalty, the general distributed the spoils of war among them. During the war against Mithridates, Sulla housed his men with the wealthy residents of Asia, where they lived as they pleased, receiving 16 drachmas a day. These first generals, Marius and Sulla, were still Roman magistrates. However, wealthy individuals like Pompey and Crassus soon began to pay the soldiers. By 78 BC, at the death of Sulla, there were 4 armies, raised entirely by and commanded by ordinary citizens. From that time, there were no more legions of Rome. There were only the legions of Pompey or Caesar. The revolution, the need for revolution. The Roman people had become an impoverished and lazy mass, and the army had become a gathering of adventurers. Neither the assembly nor the legions obeyed the Senate, as the corrupt nobles had lost all moral authority. Thus, there remained only one real power, the army. There were no influential men other than the generals, and the generals no longer had any desire to obey. The government by the Senate was no longer practical, and the government of the general took its place. The civil wars. The revolution was inevitable, but it did not happen overnight. It took more than a century to accomplish. The Senate resisted, but it was too weak to govern and strong enough to prevent domination by another power. The generals fought among themselves to determine who would remain in power. For a century, The Romans and their subjects lived in the midst of chaos and civil war. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, hailed from one of the most esteemed families in Rome. However, they sought to overthrow the Senate and take control of the government by becoming tribunes of the plebs. At that time, there was a large group of citizens in Rome and Italy who desired a revolution, including many poor citizens, and even the majority of the rich knights who felt left out of the government. Tiberius Gracchus became tribune of the plebs and proposed an agrarian law that would resume all lands of the public domain occupied by individuals, except for 500 acres per person. These lands would then be redistributed in small lots to poor citizens. The law was passed, but it caused widespread confusion regarding property ownership, since most lands in the empire were considered part of the public domain, yet had been occupied for a long time by people who saw themselves as rightful owners. Additionally, the Romans had no land registry, making it difficult to determine whether a domain was private or public property. To oversee these operations, Tiberius appointed 3 commissioners, including his brother and father-in-law, who were granted absolute authority by the people. It was unclear whether Tiberius had acted in the interest of the people or simply to gain power. For a year, he ruled Rome, but when he sought to be re-elected tribune of the plebs for the following year, his opponents protested, leading to a riot. Tiberius and his supporters took refuge at the capital, but were pursued and killed by the Senate's partisans and their slaves, armed with clubs and fragments of benches in the year 133. 10 years after the death of Tiberius Gracchus, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 123 BC. He revived the agrarian law and established distributions of corn to poor citizens. To weaken the power of the nobles, he secured a decree that the judges should be taken from among the knights. For 2 years, Gaius dominated the government, but when he was absent from the city conducting a colony of Roman citizens to Carthage, the people abandoned him. On his return, he could not be re-elected. The consul armed the partisans of the Senate and marched against Gaius and his friends who had fled to the Aventine Hill. Gaius had himself killed by a slave, and his followers were massacred or executed in prison. Their houses were razed, and their property was confiscated. The riots in the streets of Rome between the Gracchi and the Senate were just the beginning. The strife that followed was a series of real wars between regular armies, wars in Italy, and wars in all the provinces. From this time, the party chiefs were no other than the generals. The first to use his army to secure obedience in Rome was Marius. He was born in Arpinum, a little town in the mountains, and was not of noble descent. He had attained reputation as an officer in the army, and had been elected tribune of the plebs, then praetor, with the help of the nobles. He turned against them and was elected consul, and commissioned with the war against Jugurtha, king of Numidia, who had already fought several Roman armies. It was then that Marius enrolled poor citizens for whom military service became a profession. With his army, Marius conquered Jugurtha and the barbarians, the Cimbri and Teutones, who had invaded the empire. He then returned to Rome, where he had himself elected consul for the 6th time and now exercised absolute power. 2 parties now took form in Rome who called themselves the party of the people or the party of Marius, and the party of the nobles, meaning that of the Senate. The partisans of Marius committed so many acts of violence that they ended up making him unpopular. Sulla, a nobleman from the great family of the Cornelii, took advantage of this circumstance to challenge Marius's power. Sulla was also a general. When the Italians rose against Rome to secure the right of citizenship and raised great armies that marched almost to the gates of the city, it was Sulla who saved Rome by fighting the Italians. He became consul and was tasked with the war against Mithridates, the king of Pontus, who had invaded Asia Minor and massacred all the Romans in 88. Marius, out of jealousy, incited a riot in the city. Sulla departed and joined his army, which was waiting for him in southern Italy, and then returned to Rome. Roman religion prohibited soldiers from entering the city under arms. The consul had to lay aside his mantle of war and assume the toga even before passing the gates. Sulla was the first general who dared to violate this restriction. Marius took flight, but when Sulla left for Asia, Marius came with an army of adventurers and forcibly entered Rome in 87. Then the proscriptions began. The principal partisans of Sulla were outlawed, and orders were given to kill them wherever they were found, and to confiscate their goods. Marius died some months later, but his main supporter, Cinna, continued to govern Rome and put to death whomever he pleased. During this period, Sulla had conquered Mithridates and secured the loyalty of his soldiers by granting them the spoils of Asia. He returned to Italy with his army in the year 83. His adversaries opposed him with 5 armies, but they were either defeated or deserted. Sulla entered Rome, executed his prisoners, and overthrew the supporters of Marius. After several days of carnage, he began to proceed systematically. He posted 3 lists of those he wished to be killed. I have now posted all those whom I can remember. I have forgotten many, but their names will be added to the list as they come to me. Every proscribed individual, meaning anyone whose name was on the list, was marked for death, and the person who brought their head was rewarded. The property of the proscribed was confiscated. Proscription was not the outcome of any trial but the general's whim, and without any warning. Sulla thus massacred not only his adversaries, but also the wealthy whose property he desired. It is said that a citizen who was not accustomed to politics glanced at the list of proscriptions and saw his name at the top of the list. "Oh no!" he exclaimed, "my Alban house has been the cause of my death." Sulla is believed to have proscribed 1,800 knights. After eliminating his opponents, he attempted to establish a government in which the Senate held all power. He appointed himself as dictator, an old title previously given to generals in times of danger, which granted absolute power. Sulla used the position to enact laws that altered the entire constitution. From that point on, all judges were to be selected from the Senate. No law could be debated before it was accepted by the Senate, and the right to propose laws was taken away from the tribunes of the plebs. After these reforms, Sulla resigned from his position and retired to private life in the year 79. He knew he had nothing to fear because he had stationed 100,000 of his soldiers in Italy. Pompey and Caesar. The Senate had regained its power thanks to Sulla, but it lacked the strength to keep it if a general wished to seize it again. Nevertheless, the Senate's rule appeared to last for over 30 years, because several generals prevented any one rival from gaining all power. After Sulla's death, 4 armies emerged. 2 were led by generals who supported the Senate, Crassus and Pompey, while the other 2 followed generals who were against the Senate, Lepidus in Italy and Sertorius in Spain. It's noteworthy that none of these armies were regular, and none of the generals were magistrates with the right to command troops. Until then, generals had been consuls, but now they were private individuals, and their soldiers joined them not to serve the state but to profit at the expense of the inhabitants. The armies of the Senate's enemies were destroyed, and Crassus and Pompey were left to control affairs. They were elected consuls, and Pompey was given command of 2 wars. He went to Asia with a devoted army and ruled Rome for several years. However, as he held more offices than power, he changed nothing in the government. It was during this time that Caesar, a young noble, became popular. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar joined forces to divide the power between themselves. Crassus received command of the army sent to Asia against the Parthians and was killed in 53. Pompey remained in Rome while Caesar went to Gaul, where he stayed for 8 years, subduing the country and building an army for himself. Pompey and Caesar were now the only players in the game. Both wanted to be the master. Pompey had the upper hand as he was in Rome and had control over the Senate. On the other hand, Caesar had his army, which was disciplined through 8 years of expeditions. Pompey got the Senate to pass a decree that Caesar should give up his army and return to Rome. Caesar, in turn, decided to cross the boundary of his province, the river Rubicon, and march on Rome. Pompey had no army in Italy to defend himself, so he and the majority of the senators fled to the other side of the Adriatic. Pompey had several armies in Spain, Greece, and Africa. Caesar defeated them one by one, starting with Spain in 49, then Greece at Pharsalus in 48, and finally Africa in 46. Pompey, defeated at Pharsalus, fled to Egypt where the king had him assassinated. After returning to Rome, Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years and exercised absolute power. The Senate even paid him divine honors, and it is possible that Caesar desired the title of king. However, he was assassinated by some of his favorites who aimed to re-establish the sovereignty of the Senate in 44. The people of Rome, who loved Caesar, forced Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the assassins, to flee. They went to the east, where they raised a large army. The west remained under the control of Antony, who governed Rome despotically with the support of Caesar's army. In his will, Caesar had adopted his sister's son, an 18-year-old boy named Octavian, who then assumed the name of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar Octavianus, according to Roman tradition. Octavian rallied the soldiers of Caesar to his side, and was tasked by the Senate with waging war against Antony. However, after defeating him, he chose to join forces with him for a division of power. They brought Lepidus into the fold, and all three returned to Rome, securing absolute power for 5 years under the title of triumvirs for organizing public affairs. They started by condemning their enemies and personal foes. Antony ensured the death of Cicero in 43 BC. Then they traveled to the east to vanquish the conspirators' army. Once they had split the empire among themselves, it was impossible to maintain harmony, and war broke out in Italy. The soldiers forced them to negotiate peace. They made a new division. Antony took the east, and Octavian took the west in 39 BC. For some years, peace reigned. Antony lived like an oriental monarch with Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt. Octavian had to fight against Pompey's sons. Eventually, the two leaders had a falling out, and the final civil war erupted. This was a conflict between the east and the west. It was decided by the naval battle of Actium. Antony fled to Egypt and committed suicide after being deserted by Cleopatra's fleet. Octavian was left alone and became the absolute ruler of the empire. The Senate's government came to an end. The need for peace. Everyone had suffered from these wars. The soldiers looted, tormented, and massacred the inhabitants of the provinces. Each of the opposing generals forced them to take sides, and the winner punished them for supporting the loser. The generals promised land to the old soldiers, and then expelled all the city's inhabitants to make room for the veterans. The wealthy Romans risked their lives and property. When their faction was defeated, they were at the mercy of the victor. Sulla had set the precedent for organized massacres in 81 BC. 40 years later, Octavian and Antony drew up lists of condemnation again in 43 BC. The common people suffered. The grain on which they depended no longer arrived in Rome with regularity because of pirates or an enemy fleet. After a century of this way of life, all the Romans and provincials, whether rich or poor, had one common desire: peace. It was during this time that the heir of Caesar, Octavian, who was one of the triumvirs and his nephew, presented himself to the people who were tired of the civil discord. He had defeated his two colleagues and drew to himself all the powers of the people, the Senate, and the magistrates. For 12 years he ruled as an emperor without having the title. No one dared to resist him. He had brought peace to the world by closing the temple of Janus, and this was what everyone wished for. The government of the Republic by the Senate only represented pillage and civil war. A strong master was needed to stop the wars and revolutions. Thus, the Roman Empire was founded. Chapter 24. The Emperors. The emperor was the one man who held absolute power in the new regime. He was known as the imperator, or the commander. He alone exercised all the functions of the ancient magistrates. He presided over the Senate, commanded all the armies, levied taxes, and was the supreme judge. He was even the Pontifex Maximus, and had the power of the tribunes. To show that he was a superhuman being, he was given the religious surname Augustus, meaning the Venerable. The empire was not established through a radical revolution. The name of the Republic was not suppressed, and for over 3 centuries, the standards of the soldiers continued to bear the initials SPQR. The emperor's power was granted to him for life, unlike the old magistrates who had it for 1 year. The emperor was the only lifelong magistrate of the Republic, and in him the Roman people were incarnate, which is why he was absolute. As long as the emperor lived, he was the sole master of the empire, as the Roman people had conveyed all its power to him. But upon his death, the Senate reviewed his life and passed judgment upon it in the name of the people. If he were condemned, all his acts were nullified, his statues thrown down, and his name effaced from the monuments. However, if his acts were ratified, which almost always occurred, the Senate decreed that the deceased emperor should be elevated to the rank of the gods. The majority of the emperors became gods after their death, and temples were raised to them, with priests appointed to render their worship. Throughout the empire, there were temples dedicated to the god Augustus and the goddess Roma. Persons are known who performed the functions of flamen, or priest, of the divine Claudius or the divine Vespasian. This practice of deifying the dead emperor was called apotheosis, a Greek word. The custom probably came from the Greeks of the Orient, the Senate and the people. The Roman Senate remained what it had always been, the assembly of the wealthiest and most distinguished individuals of the empire. To be a senator was still a highly coveted honor. When referring to a prominent family, one would say a senatorial family. However, while the Senate was respected, It had lost its power as the emperor could easily dismiss it. Although it remained the most prestigious body in the state, it was no longer in control of the government. The emperor would often pretend to seek its advice, but was not obligated to follow it. The people had lost all their power since the assemblies or the comitia were abolished during the reign of Tiberius. The population of 2 million residents in Rome consisted of only a few thousand wealthy lords with their slaves and a throng of paupers. The state had already taken on the responsibility of feeding the latter, with the emperors continuing to distribute grain and provide money or the congiarium. Augustus donated $140 each in 9 different distributions, while Nero gave $50 in 3. Additionally, shows were presented to entertain the populace. Under the Republic, the number of days regularly appointed for shows was 66 per year. In a century and a half, under Marcus Aurelius, it had increased to 135, and in the 4th century to 175, not including supplementary days. These spectacles continued from sunrise to sunset each day, with the spectators eating lunch in their seats. The emperors used this as a means of occupying the crowd. "It is for your advantage, Caesar," said an actor to Augustus, "that the people engage themselves with us." It was also a way of gaining popularity. The worst emperors were among the most popular. Nero was adored for his magnificent spectacles, and the people refused to believe that he was dead, waiting for his return for 30 years. The city of Rome, once a great power, had become a place of amusement and sustenance. As Juvenal put it, the people only required bread and the games of the circus, or food and entertainment. The Praetorians, a group of about 10,000 soldiers, were the emperor's personal military escort. They were recruited from veterans, paid well, and given frequent bonuses. With the Praetorians on his side, the emperor had nothing to fear from dissidents in Rome. However, the real danger came from the Praetorians themselves. They believed that their power gave them free rein, and their leader, the Praetorian prefect, was sometimes even stronger than the emperor. Since the monarchy had replaced the Republic, the emperor was the only magistrate. With an empire of 80 million people to govern, the emperor needed assistance. He found them among the slaves, whom he trusted more than the men of great families. The emperor's secretaries, trusted men and ministers were all freedmen, mostly from Greece or the Orient. They were pliant people, skilled in flattery, inventiveness, and loquacity. Sometimes, when the emperor was tired of serious matters, he left the government in their hands. In absolute monarchies, the freedmen often supplemented their master instead of aiding him. Claudius's freedmen, Pallas and Narcissus, distributed offices and pronounced judgments. Helius, Nero's freedman, even executed knights and senators without consulting his master. Of all the freedmen, Pallas was the most powerful, richest, and insolent. He gave orders to his underlings only by signs or in writing. This outraged the old noble families of Rome. As a Roman writer put it, "The princes are the masters of citizens and the slaves of their freedmen." One of the gravest scandals with which the emperors were reproached was governing Roman citizens by former slaves. Despotism and disorder. In ancient Rome, the rulers had 2 major flaws that plagued their regime. 1. Despotism. The emperor held an unlimited, extravagant, and almost inconceivable power for life. They could dispose of people and their property, condemn, confiscate, and execute without any restraint. The emperor's will was not fettered by any institution or law. The juris consults themselves said, "The decree of the emperor has the force of law." The Roman Empire recognized the unlimited despotism that the tyrants had exercised in the Greek cities. While some honorable tyrants presented themselves in Greece, some wise and honest monarchs like Augustus, Vespasian, and Titus appeared in Rome. However, few men had a head strong enough to resist vertigo when they saw themselves so elevated above other men. The majority of the emperors profited from their tremendous power only to make their names proverbial. Tiberius, Nero, Domitian by their cruelty, Vitellius by his gluttony, and Claudius by his imbecility. One of them, Caligula, was a veritable fool. He had his horse made consul and himself worshipped as a god. The emperors persecuted the nobles, especially to keep them from conspiring against them, and the rich to confiscate their goods. 2. Disorder. This overweening authority was, moreover, very ill-regulated, residing entirely in the person of the emperor. When the emperor died, everything was in question. It was well known that the world could not continue without a master, but no law or usage determined who was to be this master. The Senate alone had the right of nominating the emperor, but almost always it would elect under pressure the one whom the preceding emperor had designated, or the man who was pleasing to the soldiers. After the death of Caligula, some praetorians who were looting the palace found a terrified poor man hiding behind a tapestry. He turned out to be a relative of Caligula, and the praetorians made him emperor. This man was Claudius. Following Nero's death, the Senate elected Galba as emperor. However, the praetorians did not find him liberal enough and massacred him to put Otho, a favorite of Nero, in his place. The soldiers on the frontier also wanted to make an emperor, and the legions of the Rhine entered Italy to overthrow the praetorians at Bedriac near Cremona. The battle lasted all night, and the soldiers compelled the Senate to elect their general, Vitellius, as emperor. Meanwhile, the army of Syria had elected Vespasian as their chief. Vespasian defeated Vitellius and was named emperor in his place. Thus, in 2 years, 3 emperors were created, and 3 were overthrown by the soldiers. The new emperor often undid what his predecessor had done, and imperial despotism was not even stable. The regime of oppression interrupted by violence lasted for more than a century, from 31 BC to 96 AD. The 12 emperors who came to the throne during this time are known as the 12 Caesars, although only the first 6 were from the family of Augustus. It is difficult to judge them fairly. Almost all of them persecuted the noble families of Rome, whom they feared, and it is the writers of these families who have made their reputation. However, it is possible that their government was mild and just in the provinces, superior to that of the senators of the Republic. This period is known as the Century of the Antonines, named after the 4 emperors who ruled during this time: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius. They were known for their wisdom, justice, and benevolence, and their reigns were marked by peace and prosperity. However, their successors were not as successful, and the empire began to decline. The Antonines, 5 emperors who succeeded the 12 Caesars, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus Aurelius from 96 until 180, were renowned for their justice and wisdom. Although the name Antonines properly belongs only to the last 2, they have all left a lasting legacy. Unlike the old families of Rome, Trajan and Hadrian were Spaniards, and Antoninus was born in Nimes, Gaul. They were not princes of imperial families, destined from birth to rule. 4 emperors ascended the throne without sons, so the empire could not be inherited. Instead, the prince chose the man most capable of succeeding him from among his generals and governors, adopted him as his son, and sought confirmation from the Senate. Thus, only experienced men came to the empire, who without confusion assumed the throne of their adoptive fathers. During this century of the Antonines, the ancient world experienced unprecedented calm. Wars were relegated to the empire's frontier, and military seditions, tyranny, and arbitrary condemnations were still present in the interior. However, the Antonines held the army in check, organized a council of state of jurisconsults, established tribunals, and replaced the freedmen who had so long irritated the Romans under the 12 Caesars with regular functionaries taken from among the men of the second class, the knights. The emperor was no longer a tyrant served by the soldiers, but truly the first magistrate of the Republic, using his authority only for the good of the citizens. The last 2 Antonines, Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius, honored the empire with their integrity. Both lived simply, like ordinary men, although they were very rich, without anything that resembled a court or a palace, never giving the impression that they were masters. Marcus Aurelius consulted the Senate on all state business and regularly attended its sessions. Marcus Aurelius, in particular, has been termed the philosopher on the throne. He governed from a sense of duty against his disposition, for he loved solitude. Yet he spent his life in administration and the command of armies. His private journal, his Thoughts, exhibits the character of the Stoic, virtuous, austere, separated from the world, and yet mild and good. The best form of vengeance on the wicked is not to imitate them. The gods themselves do good to evil men. It is your privilege to act like the gods. In the days of the Antonine emperors, the Roman Empire continued its path of conquest. The first-century emperors had already subdued the Britons in England and the Germans on the left bank of the Rhine, and had taken control of several countries that had previously retained their own kings, such as Mauritania, Thrace, and Cappadocia. The empire's borders were marked by the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates. The second-century emperors were mostly generals. and they had ample opportunity to wage wars against hostile peoples attempting to invade the empire. The enemies were particularly concentrated in two areas. 1. The Dacians, a barbarous people who lived in the mountainous and forested region now known as Transylvania, were located on the Danube. 2. The Parthians, a great military monarchy with its capital at Ctesiphon near the ruins of Babylon, extended over all of Persia and were located on the Euphrates. Trajan, one of the Antonine emperors, launched several expeditions against the Dacians. He crossed the Danube and won 3 significant battles, ultimately taking the Dacians' capital from 101 to 102. He offered them peace, but when they reopened the war, he decided to end the conflict once and for all. He had a stone bridge built over the Danube and invaded Dacia, reducing it to a Roman province in 106. Colonies were established there, cities were constructed, and Dacia became a Roman province where Latin was spoken and Roman customs were assimilated. Even after the Roman armies withdrew at the end of the 3rd century, the Latin language remained and persisted throughout the Middle Ages, despite invasions by the barbarian Slavs. The peoples who now inhabit the plains to the north of the Danube came from Transylvania, or ancient Dacia, from the 12th to the 14th century. It has preserved the name of Rome or Romania and speaks a language derived from Latin, similar to French or Spanish. Trajan also waged war on the Parthians. He crossed the Euphrates, took Ctesiphon, the capital, and advanced into Persia, even reaching Susa, from which he took the massive gold throne of the kings of Persia. He constructed a fleet on the Tigris, sailed down the river to its mouth, and sailed into the Persian Gulf. He would have been thrilled, like Alexander, to conquer India. He took control of the country between the Euphrates and the Tigris, including Assyria and Mesopotamia, and established 2 Roman provinces there. To honor his victories, Trajan built monuments that still stand today. The Column of Trajan, located in the Roman Forum, is a towering structure adorned with bas-reliefs depicting the war against the Dacians. Meanwhile, the Arch of Triumph in Benevento serves as a reminder of the triumphs over the Parthians. However, of these 2 conquests, only one proved to be permanent, that of Dacia. The provinces taken from the Parthians rebelled after the Roman army's departure. Emperor Hadrian chose to keep Dacia, but returned the provinces to the Parthians, once again making the Euphrates the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire. To avoid further conflict with the Scottish Highlanders, Hadrian built a wall in the north of England, known as the Wall of Hadrian, which spanned the entire island. The only remaining conflict was against the rebellious Jews, whom the Romans defeated and expelled from Jerusalem, renaming the city to erase the memory of the old Jewish kingdom. The last of the Antonines, Marcus Aurelius, faced an invasion from several barbaric Germanic tribes that had crossed the Danube on the ice and made their way as far as Aquileia in northern Italy. To assemble a sufficient army, Marcus had to enlist slaves and barbarians. The Germans eventually retreated, but while Marcus was dealing with a general uprising in Syria, they launched another attack on the empire. The emperor died on the banks of the Danube in 180, marking the end of the conquest. In the 2nd century, the Roman emperors were not particularly interested in conquest. However, they continued to conquer barbarian peoples for over a century to keep their army occupied and secure easily defensible frontiers. After Trajan, the course of conquest was finally halted, and the empire extended over the south of Europe, the north of Africa, and the west of Asia. The empire was limited by natural frontiers, including the ocean to the west, the mountains of Scotland, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Caucasus to the north, the deserts of the Euphrates and Arabia to the east, and the cataracts of the Nile and the Great Desert to the south. The empire included the territories that now make up England, Spain, Italy, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Bavaria, Austria, Hungary, European Turkey, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Asiatic Turkey. This empire was more than twice the size of Alexander's empire. This vast territory was divided into 48 provinces of unequal size, but most of them were quite large. For example, Gaul from the Pyrenees to the Rhine was divided into only 7 provinces. In the provinces of the interior, there was no Roman army because the peoples of the empire had no desire to revolt. However, on the frontier, the empire had enemies, including foreigners who were always ready to invade. Behind the Rhine and the Danube were the barbarian Germans. Behind the sands of Africa were the nomads of the desert, and behind the Euphrates was the Persian army. On this constantly threatened frontier, it was necessary to have soldiers always ready. Augustus understood this and created a permanent army. The soldiers of the empire were no longer proprietors transferred from their fields to serve during a few campaigns, but poor men who made war their profession. They enlisted for 16 or 20 years and often re-enlisted. There were 30 legions of citizens, which means there were 180,000 legionaries, and, according to Roman usage, a slightly larger number of auxiliaries, making a total of about 400,000 men. This number was small for such a vast territory. In the early days of the Roman Empire, each frontier province had its own little army, stationed in a permanent camp that resembled a fortress. As merchants came to establish themselves in the area, the camp slowly transformed into a city. However, the soldiers remained encamped in the face of the enemy, preserving their valor and discipline. For 3 centuries there were severe wars, especially on the banks of the Rhine and Danube rivers, where Roman soldiers fought fiercely against barbarians in a swampy, uncultivated land covered with forests and bogs. Despite the obscurity of these wars, the imperial army exhibited as much bravery and energy as the ancient Romans did during the conquest of the world. All the provinces belonged to the emperor, who represented the Roman people. As such, he was the general of all soldiers, master of all persons, and proprietor of all lands. However, since the emperor couldn't be everywhere at once, he appointed deputies to represent him. Each province had a lieutenant, called a deputy of Augustus with the function of praetor, who governed the country, commanded the army, and travelled throughout the province to judge important cases. Like the emperor, the praetor had the right of life and death. The emperor also sent a financial agent, called the procurator of Augustus, to levy taxes and return the money to the imperial chest. These 2 men represented the emperor, governing his subjects, commanding his soldiers, and exploiting his domain. The emperor always chose them from the 2 nobilities of Rome, the praetors from the senators, and the procurators from the knights. They held a succession of offices, passing from one province to another, from one end of the empire to the other, from Syria to Spain, and from Britain to Africa. The epitaphs of officials from this time carefully inscribed all the posts they had occupied, and inscriptions on their tombs were sufficient to construct their biographies. Municipal life. Beneath the all-powerful representatives of the emperor, the smaller subject peoples continued to govern themselves. The emperor had the right to interfere in their local affairs, but typically chose not to exercise this right. Instead, he simply demanded that they maintain peace, pay their taxes regularly, and appear before the governor's tribunal. In every province, there were several of these little subordinate governments, called cities or municipalities, just as the Roman state was called at other times. The provincial cities were modelled after Rome, with their own assembly of the people, magistrates elected for a year and grouped into colleges of 2 members, and a senate called a curia, made up of the great proprietors, wealthy people of old family. As in Rome, the assembly of the people was little more than a formality. It was the nobility, or senate, that truly governed. The centre of the provincial city was always a town, a miniature Rome, complete with temples, triumphal arches, public baths, fountains, theatres, and arenas for combats. The life led there was that of Rome on a small scale, distributions of grain and money, public banquets, grand religious ceremonies, and bloody spectacles. However, in the municipalities, it was the nobility itself that defrayed the costs of government and festivities, rather than the money of the provinces paying the expenses, as was the case in Rome. The tax levied for the treasury of the emperor went entirely to the imperial chest, so the rich of the city had to celebrate the games, heat the baths, pave the streets, and construct the bridges, aqueducts, and circuses at their own expense. They did so generously for more than 2 centuries, as monuments scattered throughout the empire and thousands of inscriptions attest. The imperial regime. After the conquest, 300 or 400 families of the nobility of Rome reigned over and exploited the rest of the world. The emperor stripped them of their power and subjected them to his tyranny. Roman writers lamented their lost liberty, but the inhabitants of the provinces had nothing to mourn. Instead of several hundred masters, constantly replaced and determined to enrich themselves, they now had a single ruler, the emperor, who had an interest in sparing them. Tiberius summed up the imperial policy when he said, "A good shepherd shears his sheep, but does not flay them." For over 2 centuries, the emperors contented themselves with shearing the people of the empire. They took much of their money, but protected them from external enemies, and even from their own officials. If the provincials had any grievances due to the violence or robbery of their governor, they could appeal to the emperor and receive justice. The emperor was known to receive complaints against his subordinates, which was enough to scare bad governors and reassure subjects. Some emperors, like Marcus Aurelius, realized that they had duties to their subjects. The other emperors at least allowed their subjects to govern themselves when they had no interest in preventing it. The imperial regime was a loss for the Romans, but a deliverance for their subjects. It humbled the conquerors and elevated the conquered, reconciling them and preparing them for assimilation into the empire. Social life. During the Roman Empire, moral decay continued to plague Rome during the reign of the Caesars, as depicted in the letters of Seneca and the satires of Juvenal. The corruption of the time was so notorious that it has become proverbial. The disorders that plagued the Republic, such as the extravagance of the rich, the cruelty of masters towards their slaves, and the frivolity of women, persisted under the imperial regime. These evils were not caused by the empire itself, but rather by the excessive accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few thousand nobles and upstarts. Meanwhile, hundreds of free men lived in poverty, and millions of slaves were subjected to unrestrained oppression. Each of these wealthy proprietors lived like a petty prince, surrounded by their slaves. Their homes in Rome were like palaces, and every morning the Hall of Honor, or the atrium, was filled with clients who came to greet the master and escort him in the street for a meager salary. Fashion demanded that a rich man should never appear in public without a crowd of followers. Horace even ridiculed a praetor who traversed the streets of Tibur with only 5 slaves in his entourage. Outside of Rome, the wealthy owned magnificent villas at the seashore or in the mountains, but they went from one to the other, idle and bored. These great families were rapidly dying out, and Augustus had made laws to encourage marriage and punish celibacy. However, his laws did not remedy the problem. So many rich men had not married that it had become a lucrative trade to flatter them in order to be mentioned in their will. By having no children, one could surround himself with a crowd of flatterers. In the city, says a Roman storyteller, all men divide themselves into 2 classes, those who fish and those who are angled for. Losing one's children increased one's influence. The spectacles. In the life of the idle people of Rome, the spectacles held a place that we can hardly conceive of today. They were, like in Greece, games that were also religious ceremonies. These games went on throughout the day and the following day, and sometimes even for a week. The amphitheatre was the gathering place for the entire free population, and it was there that they showed themselves. In 196, during the civil wars, all the spectators cried out with one voice, "Peace!" The spectacle was the passion of the time. 3 emperors even appeared in public, Caligula as a driver, Nero as an actor, and Commodus as a gladiator. The theatre. There were 3 types of spectacles: the theatre, the circus, and the amphitheatre. The theatre was organized based on Greek models. The actors were masked and presented plays imitated from the Greek. The Romans had little taste for this recreation, which was too delicate for them. They preferred the mimes, comedies of a coarse character, and especially the pantomimes, in which the actor expressed the sentiments of the character through his attitude without speaking. The circus. Between the 2 hills of the Aventine and the Palatine extended a field filled with racecourses surrounded by arcades and tiers of seats rising above them. This was the Circus Maximus. After Nero enlarged it, it could accommodate 250,000 spectators. In the 4th century, its size was increased to provide seating for 385,000 people. Here was presented the favorite spectacle of the Roman people, the 4-horse chariot race, or quadrigae. In each race, the chariot made a triple circuit of the circus, and there were 25 races in a single day. The drivers belonged to rival companies whose colors they wore. There were initially 4 of these colors, but they were later reduced to 2, the blue and the green, notorious in the history of riots. At Rome, there was the same passion for chariot races that there is now for horse races. Women and even children talked about them. Often the emperor participated, and the quarrel between the blues and the greens became an affair of state. The amphitheatre stands at the gates of Rome, a grand edifice constructed by Emperor Vespasian. Its 2 stories can hold up to 87,000 spectators who come to witness the circus surrounding the arena where hunts and combats take place. During the hunts, the arena transforms into a forest where wild beasts are released to fight against men armed with spears. The spectacle aims to entertain the audience by employing the rarest animals, including lions, panthers, elephants, bears, buffaloes, rhinoceroses, giraffes, tigers, and crocodiles. Some emperors even maintain a large menagerie to showcase these animals. However, instead of armed men, sometimes the beasts are let loose on naked and bound men, which proves to be more dramatic. This custom spreads throughout the empire, compelling those condemned to death to furnish this form of entertainment for the people. Thousands of people of all ages and sexes, including Christian martyrs, are devoured by beasts under the eyes of the multitude. The national spectacle of the Romans is the fight of gladiators, men armed with swords. Armed men descend into the arena and fight a duel to the death. From the time of Caesar, as many as 320 pairs of gladiators fought at once. Augustus fought 10,000 of them in his lifetime, and Trajan had the same number in 4 months. The vanquished is slain on the field unless the people wish to show him mercy. The condemned are sometimes compelled to fight, but more often slaves and prisoners of war are forced into the arena. Each victory brings bands of barbarians to the amphitheatre who exterminate one another for the delight of the spectators. Gladiators are furnished by all countries, including Gauls, Germans, and Thracians. These peoples fight with various weapons, usually with their national arms. The Romans loved to behold these battles in miniature. In the midst of the circus contestants, there were those who fought not because they were slaves, but because they chose to. These were free men who craved the thrill of danger and willingly subjected themselves to the brutal discipline of the gladiator. They pledged to their leader that they would endure being beaten with rods, burned with hot iron, and even killed. Some senators even joined these bands of adventurers, and one emperor, Commodus, even descended into the arena. These bloody games were not limited to Rome, but were also practiced in all the cities of Italy, Gaul, and Africa. The Greeks, however, always opposed their adoption. In the small city of Minturnae, an inscription on a statue of one of the notables reads, "He presented in 4 days 11 pairs of gladiators who ceased to fight only when half of them had fallen in the arena. He gave a hunt of 10 terrible bears. Treasure this in memory, noble fellow citizens." The people had a passion for blood, which is still evident in Spain's bullfights. The emperor, like the modern king of Spain, was expected to attend these barbaric spectacles. Marcus Aurelius, however, became unpopular in Rome because he showed his weariness at the amphitheatre's games by reading, speaking, or giving audiences instead of watching the games. When he enlisted gladiators to serve against the barbarians who invaded Italy, the populace was on the verge of revolt. "He would deprive us of our amusements," cried one, "to compel us to become philosophers." The Roman Empire was more than just the city of Rome. To truly understand the empire, one must look at events in the provinces. The Romans had conquered and subdued all peoples, which led to the suppression of war within the empire. This established what the Greeks called the Roman peace. It was a time when anyone could go anywhere without fear, and the land was safe for all. The earth was common to everyone, as Homer had said. For the first time, people in the West could build their homes and cultivate their fields without fear of being robbed, massacred, or enslaved. This security was something we take for granted today, but it was a luxury for people in ancient times. With peace came easy travel. The Romans built roads in every direction, making it easy for people to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Artisans, traders, rhetors, and philosophers traveled throughout Europe, giving lectures and spreading their knowledge. People from remote provinces could be found in every province, bringing with them their customs, arts, and religion. They mingled and transported these things, slowly adapting to the language of the Romans. By the 3rd century, Latin had become the common language of the West, just as Greek had been the language of the Orient since the time of Alexander the Great. This led to the development of a common civilization, which has been called Roman, even though it was more than just that. It was the civilization of the ancient world united under the emperor's authority. Superstitions were woven into the fabric of ancient religious beliefs. With no concept of a single deity, it was simple for them to accept new gods. Each people had their own religion, but instead of rejecting the beliefs of others, they embraced the gods of their neighbors and merged them with their own. The Romans were the pioneers of this practice, constructing the Pantheon, a temple dedicated to all the gods, where each deity had their own sanctuary. Credulity was rampant, and people believed in the divinity of deceased emperors. It was said that Vespasian had miraculously healed a blind man and a paralytic in Egypt. During the war with the Dacians, the Roman army was dying of thirst. Suddenly rain began to pour down, and the sudden storm was seen as a miracle. Some claimed that an Egyptian magician had conjured Hermes, while others believed that Jupiter had taken pity on the soldiers. On the column of Marcus Aurelius, Jupiter was depicted with a thunderbolt in hand, sending the rain that the soldiers caught in their shields. When Barnabas and Paul, two apostles, arrived in the city of Lystra in Asia Minor, the locals mistook them for the gods Jupiter and Mercury, respectively. The people even held a procession, with priests leading a bull for sacrifice. Despite their education, the people of that time were still superstitious. Even the Stoic philosophers believed in omens, and the Emperor Augustus considered it a bad sign if he put on the wrong shoe. Suetonius once asked Pliny the Younger to postpone their meeting due to a dream he had, and Pliny himself believed in ghosts. Strangely enough, instead of fragmenting, different religions merged into a single dominant religion that was a mix of Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Asian influences. This religion was so pervasive that Christians referred to it as the religion of the nations, and until the 4th century they called the non-Christians Gentiles, or men of the nations. The common law of the time was also known as the law of nations. Chapter 25. Greek Influence on Roman Art. The Romans were not naturally inclined towards art. It wasn't until they began imitating the Greeks that they became artists. They borrowed from the Greeks their models of tragedy, comedy, epic, ode, didactic poem, pastoral poetry, and history. Some writers limited themselves to translating a Greek original freely, such as Horace in his odes, but they brought their qualities of patience and vigor into this work of adaptation, and many achieved true originality. The Golden Age of Augustus. The 50 years of Augustus's reign are widely regarded as the most brilliant period in Latin literature. It was the time of Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Tibullus, Propertius, and Livy. The emperor, or rather his friend Maecenas, personally patronized some of these poets, especially Horace and Virgil, who sang the glory of Augustus and his time. But this Augustan age was preceded and followed by 2 centuries that perhaps equaled it. In the 1st century BC, the most original Roman poet Caesar appeared, along with the most elegant prose writer and the greatest orator Cicero. In the following age, Seneca, Lucan, Tacitus, Pliny, and Juvenal wrote. Between Lucretius and Tacitus, there were many great writers in Rome for 3 centuries. One might also add another century by going back to the time of Plautus, the 2nd century BC. Of these great authors, a few came from Roman families, but the majority were Italians. Many came from the provinces, such as Virgil from Mantua, Livy from Padua in Cisalpine Gaul, while Seneca was Spaniard. Orators and rhetors. The true national art in Rome was eloquence. Like modern Italians, the Romans loved to speak in public. In the forum, where they held assemblies of the people, was the rostrum, the platform for addressing the people, so named from the prows of captured ships that ornamented it like trophies of war. There, in the last epoch of the Republic, the orators came to declaim and gesticulate before a tumultuous crowd. The tribunals, often composed of 100 judges, furnished another occasion for eloquent advocates. Roman law permitted the accused to have an advocate speak in his place. From the 2nd century, Rome was home to orators. Like Athens, the early orators, including Cato and the Gracchi, spoke plainly, which Cicero found unsatisfactory. In the 1st century, orators learned from Greek rhetors, adopting long, pompous speeches. Cicero was the greatest of them all, and his speeches are the only ones that have survived in full. However, we have them as he wrote them, not as he delivered them. After the fall of the Republic, political trials and assemblies ceased, and eloquence died out. The rhetors proliferated, teaching the art of speaking well. Some of these teachers had their pupils compose pleas on imaginary rhetorical subjects. Seneca, a rhetor, left us with many of these oratorical themes, which covered topics such as stolen children, brigands, and romantic adventures. Public lectures became fashionable, with Pollio, a favorite of Augustus, setting the example. For a century people read poems, panegyrics, and even tragedies before an audience of friends who applauded them. The taste for eloquence that once produced great orators only produced finished declaimers in later centuries. Latin literature benefited from Rome's conquests, with the Romans taking their language and literature to their barbarian subjects in the West. All the peoples of Italy, Gaul, Spain, Africa, and the Danubian lands discarded their languages and adopted Latin. Having no national literature, they adopted that of their masters. The empire was thus divided between the two languages of the two great peoples of antiquity. The Orient continued to speak Greek, while almost the entire Occident acquired Latin. Latin was not only the official language of state functionaries and great men, like English in India today, but the people themselves spoke it with greater or lesser correctness. Today, 5 languages of Europe are derived from Latin: Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Romanian. In the West, Latin literature spread with the Latin language. In the 5th century, only Latin poets and orators were studied in the schools of Bordeaux and Autumn. Even after the barbarians arrived, bishops and monks continued to write in Latin and spread this practice to the peoples of England and Germany, who still spoke their native languages. Throughout the medieval period, acts, laws, histories, and books of science were written in Latin. In the convents and schools, only works written in Latin were read, copied, and appreciated. Besides books of piety, only Latin authors were known, such as Virgil, Horace, Cicero, and Pliny the Younger. The Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries partly consisted of reviving forgotten Latin writers. More than ever, it was fashionable to know and imitate them. As the Romans constructed a literature in imitation of the Greeks, the moderns have taken the Latin writers as their models. Whether this is good or bad, who would venture to say? But the fact is indisputable. Our Romance languages are daughters of Latin, and our literatures are full of the ideas and literary methods of the Romans. The whole Western world is impregnated with Latin literature. The arts of sculpture and painting have also been influenced by the Romans. Many Roman statues and bas-reliefs from the time of the Empire have been discovered. Some are reproductions, and almost all are imitations of Greek works, but less elegant and delicate than the models. The most original productions of this form of art are the bas-reliefs and busts. Bas-reliefs adorned monuments such as temples, columns, and triumphal arches, as well as tombs and sarcophagi. They represent real scenes with scrupulous fidelity, such as processions, sacrifices, combats, and funeral ceremonies, and thus provide us with information about ancient life. The bas-reliefs surrounding the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius bring us into the presence of the great scenes of their wars. We can see the soldiers fighting against the barbarians, besieging their fortresses, leading away the captives, the solemn sacrifices, and the emperor haranguing the troops. The busts of the emperors, their wives, and their children are found in abundance throughout the empire. The great museums of Europe house collections of these imperial busts, which are real portraits that likely bear a striking resemblance to their subjects. Each emperor had a unique and often unattractive physiognomy that was accurately captured by the artists who created these busts. Roman sculpture is known for its realistic representation of its subjects, more so than Greek sculpture. The Roman artist was less concerned with beauty and more focused on accuracy. Roman painting is mostly lost to history, with only frescoes from Pompeii and the House of Livy in Rome remaining. It is possible that these frescoes were the work of Greek painters, as they share a similar simple and elegant grace to the paintings found on Greek vases. The true Roman art form was architecture, which was driven by practical needs. Roman architecture borrowed the column from the Greeks, but also employed the arch, a technique of arranging cut stones in the arc of a circle to support one another. This allowed the Romans to construct larger and more varied buildings than the Greeks. In the ancient world, the Romans were known for their impressive monuments. Here are some of the main types. 1. The temple was a grand structure that sometimes resembled a Greek temple, but could also be larger and topped with a dome. One famous example is the Pantheon, which was built in Rome during the reign of Augustus. 2. The basilica was a long, low building with a roof and porticos. It was used as a marketplace and a courtroom, where judges and traders would gather. Later on, Christians used basilicas for their religious assemblies, and many early churches were modelled after them. 3. The amphitheatre and the circus were massive structures with multiple levels of arches surrounding an arena. They were used for public spectacles and entertainment, such as gladiatorial contests and chariot races. Famous examples include the Colosseum in Rome and the arenas in Arles and Nimes. 4. The Arch of Triumph was a grand gateway that could accommodate a chariot passing through. It was decorated with columns and sculptures and served as a symbol of victory or honor. The Arch of Titus is a well-known example. 5. The sepulchral vault was an arched building with many niches, each containing the ashes of a deceased person. It was called a columbarium because of its pigeonhole-like shape. 6. The thermae were bathing complexes with heated rooms and pools. They were popular gathering places for the idle and wealthy, and often included gardens and exercise halls. The baths of Caracalla were particularly large and impressive. 7. The bridge and the aqueduct were structures that spanned rivers and valleys, supported by rows of arches. They were essential for transportation and water supply. Examples include the Alcantara Bridge and the Pont du Gard. 8. The house of a wealthy Roman was a masterpiece of design and decoration. Unlike modern houses, the focus was on the interior, with plain walls facing the street. These houses often had courtyards, gardens, and elaborate mosaics and frescoes. The chambers were small, poorly furnished, and dimly lit, with light only filtering through the atrium. In the center stood the Grand Hall of Honor, or atrium, where statues of ancestors were erected and visitors were received. The room was illuminated by an opening in the roof. Behind the atrium was the peristyle, a garden surrounded by colonnades, where the dining halls were located. These halls were richly ornamented and provided with couches, as guests reclined on them during banquets, much like the Asiatic Greeks. The pavement was often made of mosaic. The Romans, unlike the Greeks, did not always build in marble. Instead, they used the stone found in the country, bound together with an indestructible mortar that has resisted dampness for 1,800 years. Their monuments lacked the grace of the Greek monuments, but they were large, strong, and solid, much like the Roman power. The empire's soil is still covered with their debris, and monuments almost intact can be found in remote areas such as the deserts of Africa. Repairing a Roman aqueduct was all that was needed to furnish a water system for the city of Tunis. During the time of the emperors, Rome was home to 2 million inhabitants. These people lived in poorly built, crowded houses of 5 or 6 stories. The populous quarters were a labyrinth of tortuous paths, steep and ill-paved. Juvenal, who frequented these areas, painted a picture of them that was unattractive. In Pompeii, a city of luxury, the narrow streets of a Roman city can be seen. Despite the hovels, hundreds of monuments were erected, with Augustus boasting of restoring more than 80 temples. He said, "I found a city of bricks, I leave a city of marble." His successors also worked to embellish Rome. The Forum was where the monuments accumulated, with the Capitol and its Temple of Jupiter becoming almost like the Acropolis in Athens. The most notable monumental areas were constructed in the same quarter, including the Forum of Caesar, Augustus, Nerva, and the most brilliant of all, the Forum of Trajan. 2 villas, surrounded by a park, were situated in the middle of the city, with the Golden House, built for Nero, being the most famous. The law. In the early days, the Romans had no written laws. They simply followed the customs of their ancestors, doing things the same way each generation as the one before. But in 450 BC, 10 magistrates known as the decemvirs were elected to create a set of laws. They wrote these laws on 12 tables made of stone, and thus the law of the 12 tables was born. The laws were written in short, blunt, and powerful sentences, reflecting the rough and barbaric nature of the people for whom they were created. The law of the 12 tables punished those who used magic to harm their neighbors' crops, and it dealt harshly with debtors who could not pay what they owed. If a debtor failed to pay, he would be brought before a court. If he was too sick or too old to appear, he would be given a horse to ride but no litter. He would have 30 days to pay his debt, and if he failed to do so, his creditor could bind him with straps or chains weighing 15 pounds. If he still could not pay after 60 days, he could be sold beyond the Tiber. If there were many creditors, they could cut him into pieces, and there would be no legal repercussions for doing so. As Cicero said, the law of the 12 tables was the foundation of all Roman law. Even 4 centuries after it was written, children were required to learn it in school. The symbolic process. In ancient Roman law, it was not enough to simply intend to buy, sell, or inherit. To receive justice in the Roman tribunal, one had to use specific words and gestures, in addition to presenting the case. For example, when purchasing something, the buyer would place a piece of brass, representing the price, in a balance held by a 6th citizen, while 5 others represented an assembly. If the item sold was an animal or slave, the purchaser would touch it and say, "This is mine by the law of the Romans. I have bought it with this brass, duly weighed." In the tribunal, every process was a pantomime. To reclaim an object, one would seize it with their hand. To protest a neighbor who erected a wall, one would throw a stone against it. When two men claimed proprietorship of a field, they would grasp hands and appear to fight. Then they would separate, and each declares, "I declare this field is mine by the law of the Romans. I cite you before the tribunal of the praetor to debate our right at the place in question." The judge would order them to go to the place and say, "Before these witnesses here present, this is your road to the place. Go!" The litigants would take a few steps as if to go there, symbolizing the journey. A witness would then say, "Return," and the journey would be regarded as completed. Each of the two would present a clod of earth, symbolizing the field. This would commence the trial, and then the judge would hear the case alone. Like all primitive peoples, the Romans only comprehended what they saw. Material acts served to represent the right that could not be seen. The formalism of Roman law. The Romans were meticulous in their adherence to ancient forms. They followed the letter of the law in both justice and religion, disregarding its sense. Every form was sacred and had to be strictly applied. In court cases, their maxim was, "What has already been pronounced ought to be the law." If an advocate made a mistake in even one word while reciting the formula, his case was lost. For instance, a man sued his neighbor for cutting down his vines, but he lost the case because he used the word vinia instead of aber in the formula he recited. This absolute reverence for the form allowed the Romans to make some strange accommodations. According to the law, if a father sold his son 3 times, the son would be freed from the father's power. When a Roman wanted to emancipate his son, he sold him 3 times in succession, and this comedy of sales sufficed to emancipate him. The law required that before beginning war, a herald should be sent to declare it at the enemy's frontier. When Rome wanted to make war on Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, who had his kingdom on the other side of the Adriatic, they were embarrassed to execute this formality. They came up with a solution. A subject of Pyrrhus, perhaps a deserter, bought a field in Rome. They then assumed that this territory had become Epirus's territory, and the herald threw his javelin on this land and made his solemn declaration. Like all other immature peoples, the Romans believed that consecrated formulas had a magical virtue. Jurisprudence, the law of the 12 tables, and the laws made after them were brief and incomplete. However, many questions arose that had no law for their solution. In these embarrassing cases, it was customary in Rome to consult certain individuals who were highly respected for their knowledge of legal questions. These were often old consuls or pontiffs. They gave their advice in writing, and their replies were called the responses of the wise. Usually these responses were authoritative according to the respect given to the sages. Emperor Augustus went further and named some of them whose responses should have the force of law. Thus, law began to be a science, and the men versed in law formulated new rules that became obligatory. This was jurisprudence. The praetor's edict was a crucial aspect of Roman law, requiring a supreme magistrate to apply the sacred rules of justice. Only a consul or a praetor held the power to direct a tribunal and, as the Romans put it, say the law. Consuls, who were primarily concerned with military matters, typically left this responsibility to the praetors. In Rome, there were always at least 2 praetors serving as judges. One adjudicated disputes between citizens and was known as the praetor of the city, or praetor urbanus. The other presided over cases involving citizens and aliens, and was called the praetor of the aliens, or praetor peregrinus, or more specifically, the praetor between aliens and citizens. At least 2 tribunals were necessary, since aliens were not allowed to participate in the tribunal of the citizens. Thanks to their absolute power, the praetors were able to settle cases based on their own sense of fairness.